I began shooting this journal 3 years ago. I started shooting it by accident. An uncle had given me an old movie camera from the 1920s. It started on an impulse. I wanted to make a connection between my thoughts and my actions. I have tried many times to work with these pictures and read their meanings, but I have stopped doing that and have decided to let them speak for themselves. I realized later that these pictures were alluding to something else, since I did not have the desire to structure them in any way. I realized later that my pictures were about something I didn't know anything about. In 1897, Eugene set up his camera in the corners of Paris. He stood in alleys, before hidden doorways, behind statues, in gardens, beside houses and cafes. Atget the man is something of a mystery, yet the pictures he made at the end of the last century connect us to his time. In his 20s, Eugene Atget was an actor. He performed in small theaters in and around Paris, in minor roles as a supporting character, sometimes a clever villain. He had a wife to support, and his career in the theatre was neither advancing nor paying very well. He decided to begin his second career as a professional photographer at the age of 35. In 1888, he bought a wood swiveling bellows camera and a heavy wood tripod to support it. He bought the cheapest lens he could find, a wide-angle rectilinear lens. He used this lens for the rest of his life. Atget's camera used glass plate negatives that measured 18 by 24 centimeters. He had to use a black cape to cover the back of the camera from the light as he took each picture. The plates were coated with gelatino silver bromide, which he bought already prepared in shops. took pictures in the early morning, using the mists and fogs of Paris in his compositions. In his 30 years of working, he started out photographing everything from a wide angle, showing the entire subject. After a few years, he started moving in closer, photographing partial views of spaces and buildings. Over the years, he moved in even closer, concentrating on the details of buildings, doorways, door knockers, and windows. For example, Atget spent 2 years photographing only the decorative door knockers of old Paris. After this period of moving in closer to the facades of buildings, he moved inside of them, photographing gardens and courtyards, staircases, fireplaces, hallways, and empty rooms. He was always moving in closer. He knew what needed to be photographed. He never took directions from anyone on how he should make a picture or what he should take a picture of. He never took pictures of anything in Paris that was considered famous by the rest of the world. He didn't shoot the Eiffel Tower, the Cathedral of Notre Dame, the Arc de Triomphe, the Champs-Élysées, or any of the new theatres in Paris. He once sold his photographs to be made into postcard views and stereoscopes, and his pictures could have easily served that market, but in the end he rejected it. The postcard makers wanted his negatives as well as the prints, and he refused. He didn't want to sell his negatives, he wanted to keep them. Around the turn of the century, there were societies set up in Paris to try to preserve in prints and photographs images of the city before it was to be completely changed by 20th century modernization. After 15 years of soliciting the archivists of Paris, Atget was hired to continue his work. He began to photograph old Paris for the historical records. For him, it must have been a relief. After this commission, he had the freedom of steady income by selling his prints in large quantities to the archives. Money had brought freedom, and freedom brought even better work. At the turn of the 20th century, Paris was the center of the art world. Paris itself was an aging open-air museum. Atget loved all the arts and was known to have said that he wanted to collect everything and anything about Paris. He never had any stated political beliefs, but he did donate a large collection of socialist political newspapers to a library in Paris. In that period, it was possible for a commercial photographer to make a living selling photographs of city scenes and landscapes to painters, sculptors, architects, and publishers. He would go out and photograph open fields, trees, flowers, and peaceful landscapes for painters to use as foregrounds. For architects, he would take pictures of historic buildings and streets, as well as details on buildings such as door knockers, steps, and windowsill pediments, especially in the old quarters of Paris.
Ma no, di qua ci conviene.
Atget kept meticulous notebooks containing information about his clients. He had lists of the different kinds of photographs artists liked. Often an artist who needed some pictures would drop by and spend an afternoon sifting through the small albums of photographs Atget had made by hand. As soon as one of the spaces in the book became empty through the sale of a print, he rushed to reprint the same photograph to replace the empty space. Atget lived simply but comfortably in a small four-room apartment in Paris. He had a bedroom, kitchen, parlor, and study. There was also a balcony that overlooked the street where he used to print his pictures. Every morning he would rise early with the sun. For the last 20 years of his life, he only ate pieces of sugar, milk, and bread. He was always saving his modest income for his real passion. He left very little about his life. Almost nothing personal about him remains, only his photographs, notebooks, and a few letters. He probably wanted it that way. Atjay printed his pictures directly from the glass plate negative onto albumen photographic paper in the sunlight. He usually printed them on his balcony. The pictures were then toned gold and were fixed and washed in his kitchen, where he had a small sink with running water. Sometimes chemicals were in short supply. For example, during World War I, he would prepare the photographic paper himself in order to save money. Later in his career, his friend Man Ray had offered his new camera to Atget. That camera used celluloid negatives and newer papers, but Atget refused it. He liked the older tools of photography and never changed his working methods. He would often go back to the same place at different times of day in order to study the effect of the light. Sometimes he would return to a favorite site years later and take the same subject from the same angle, in different light, or move in closer to a slightly new angle. He made a lot of mistakes, but he seemed to enjoy them. He never threw anything away. He loved to photograph trees and always wrote down what kind of tree it was. For buildings, he sometimes wrote a note like, "This will be gone soon," on the back of the picture. A typical way to photograph a building for an architect would be to take it from an angle straight on in order to see all the elevations and details of the building in proper perspective. Jay always took his pictures with his tripod at ground level, usually at an angle off to one side. He often cropped buildings, sometimes even opening the door or windows if he felt it was right. He liked to photograph directly into the sun in the early morning light, creating a halo or softening effect around the subject he was photographing. These were all things that a regular commercial photographer of that time would almost never do. Perhaps this couple was more ambitious than me. They traveled around the whole world, photographing everything they saw and everyone they met. I never photograph anyone I know, and I don't meet anyone in the process. I choose to be discreet, filming people without them ever knowing that I am filming them. I stand back and observe. But this couple jumped in and filmed as much as they could with their little portable camera. They even had others film them as they were enjoying themselves, a typical sight I see in my journeys. But to see the results of their images and have time to look at them over and over, I see nuances and graceful gestures I didn't catch all the other times I watched them. Their images placed next to mine create a striking difference, and I wonder what they must have felt, holding the camera, with all the excitement of being in a new place. Ache rarely photographed people, yet his portraits of street merchants and prostitutes stand out as some of the best of his period. It also seems that he even used a different lens to photograph people, but no one is sure. The backgrounds in the portraits are more out of focus than most of his other pictures, suggesting that he used another lens, perhaps a more telephoto one, for these pictures. He only photographed people seriously over a few years. In most of his pictures, people appear as shadows or blurs, moving too fast for his slow camera to register them as solid human figures. People appear as ghosts, if they appear at all. He didn't mind his own reflection in the shot. In one picture, you can see Ache's reflection in a mirror underneath a fireplace mantel. To him, that kind of thing didn't matter. In fact, he largely avoided having any people appear in his photographs by doing most of his work in the early morning, before anyone was awake to bother him. his middle period, when he made thousands of pictures, Atget seemed to be photographing things just for the purpose of making records. This was the period when he focused mostly on old Paris. A large part of his collection was about the old churches of Paris. He had taken many standard wide-angle views and close-ups, which he did just to get it done. He sold the bulk of that collection in 1920, declaring that his record of old Paris was now complete. He could spend the rest of his time on his own work, now that his negatives had a home in the historical records of France. Atget's best photographs were made at the beginning and end of his career. His initial photographs were made through trial and error and pure instinct. His later photographs were made with the lucid grace and understanding that over 30 years of photographing had taught him. In the first major show of his work at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1969, the curators did not yet know the date of any of his photographs. They hadn't yet figured out his numbering system. A few years later, after they had all been dated and identified, they noticed that 50% of the work they had selected for the first show was from the last 6 years of his life, the rest from the first 25 years. From the top of the building, I can see the houses all around the factory. This building even makes the churches look like they were built to worship this place. But now all the people are gone, and all that is left is this empty factory and the empty churches. The houses still look like they were meant to wrap around this dead tower. Ajay made 10,000 negatives in his lifetime. Of these, 8,500 survive. The reason many of them survive and are even noticed at all is mostly because of one person, an American photographer named Bernice Abbott. She was working in Paris as an assistant to Man Ray in 1927, who lived a few doors away on the same street as Ajay. Man Ray, like many artists in Paris, had bought a few of Ajay's photographs. But he had bought them more out of curiosity, just to have as objects around the house. He did not use them directly for material in his paintings. He thought of them as surreal images, which baffled Ajay. Bernice Abbott had heard many strange stories about Ajay, this old man who lived nearby. She decided to visit him. When she was there, she took his picture. A few weeks later, when she came back to give him the picture, he had died. He never saw her photograph of him sitting in his chair, looking like the villain from one of his plays. Right after he died, with the help of an anonymous donor, she purchased from his estate for $1,000 the remaining negatives, prints, and notebooks left in his apartment. Abbott's work as a photographer changed after Ajay died. She stopped the studio portraits she was doing and returned to the United States to photograph the city life and city people of New York. In an article she wrote in 1929, she stated that she considered Ajay to have created a document that was a tremendous achievement, especially for one person. And he did it by starting at the age of 35, in his second career. For over 40 years, she kept his negatives and prints in her possession. She was unable to do much more than maintain them in her apartment, keeping them safely for a future home, while she pursued her own career as a photographer. She kept them until 1968, when she sold them to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Ansel Adams, Walker Evans, and Edward Weston were all influenced by his work. Each was known to have seen a book of his photographs that was published in France in 1929. Ansel Adams wrote in 1931, 4 years after Ajay's death, "The charm of Ajay lies not in the mastery of the plates and papers of his time, nor in the quaintness of costume, architecture, and humanity as revealed in his pictures, but in his equitable and intimate point of view. It is a point of view which we are pleased to call modern, and which is essentially timeless. His work is a simple revelation of the simplest aspects of his environment. There is no superimposed symbolic motive, no tortured application of design, no intellectual axe to grind. The Ajay prints are direct and emotionally clean records of a rare and subtle perception and represent, perhaps, the earliest expression of true photographic art." Ajay observed the world by focusing on what we ignore. The things that are in our life every day, the street, things and places in the city. The long passage leads us back, closer to where we feel love and warmth. The landscapes, these places, empty spaces, color grains moving through time, are images about perceptions of the world as seen through one person's eyes. We participate in history by simply being. Time passes and history is recorded. How it is recorded is up to us and to our memories of what happened. If we don't participate and we leave the reading of our lives to strangers, then what can we pass on?